have too many musician friends. Most of the musicians I know have day jobs. So they play music at night and they'd love to get a record deal, but because the record companies are all falling apart, most people have been, it's forced people to approach a more DIY, or to take a more DIY approach. Where the musicians I know, they're starting their own record companies. They're releasing things online. They're getting friends of theirs to do publicity. It's people becoming a lot more self-reliant and a lot more autonomous, which I think is great. Because the record companies aren't going to be around in 5 years, or at least they're not going to be around in anything resembling the form that they've had for the last 50 years. So it's a frightening time for a lot of people, but I know this sounds cliched, but it's also a really exciting time. And I think music has benefit. The actual quality of music has been a lot better because a lot of people are putting out records purely for the love of putting out records and not hoping to sell millions of copies, because no one sells millions of copies. So the rise of like the indie rock scene, well, independent music in general, I think it's been really good for music creatively. And it's also, it's turned the music world into more of like a Scandinavian country as opposed to a South American country. Meaning, if you look at like Paraguay in the 1970s, all the wealth was concentrated in like 0.1% of the population, and everybody else was poor. And that's or you look at Sweden, where it was sort of like the wealth was distributed evenly among most of the people in the country. And the music business up until recently was like Paraguay in the 70s, where you had 0.0001% of the musicians on the planet selling tens of millions of records. And all the other musicians are sort of like, struggling to try and get the attention of a record company. And what's happened now is you have a lot of musicians and a lot of DJs who are selling 10,000 records here, 50,000 records there, and they can make a living. They're not getting rich, but they're doing relatively okay. I personally think, the demise of the record business is almost, if you have to point blame anywhere, sadly it's at the record companies themselves, because in the 80s and 90s, they kept charging more and more for CDs, even as the costs came down. So it's almost like the record labels would arbitrarily just keep charging more and more, and they were signing bands who had a shelf life of about 6 months, so there's no loyalty. People were buying CDs in the 90s because they liked a song they'd heard on the radio, but they could care less about the artist. And so the labels weren't doing artist development, and as a result, there was no loyalty engendered. And so when the record companies fell apart, most listeners, it's hard to get too upset for record companies falling apart when they've treated artists terribly for so long and treated consumers terribly for so long.